Timberly shows up.
Thank
We are officially ready. So one more to Toby. Let's go.
Minute for Toby, or are you ready to go now?
Let's go.
Cool. Awesome. Thank you everyone so much for joining us tonight, panelists and guests. My name is Kimberly Vogel. I am the Director of Community Engagement for the University of Wyoming's Black Studies Center, and I am honored to introduce our second to last event of the Black History Month celebrations we are hosting this year. Tonight's panel discussion, A Tale of Two Towns, Black Homesteaders and the Myth of the American Dream, where our panelists and moderators will be discussing the complexities and realities of emergence of Black towns in the West, specifically those that exist within Wyoming and Colorado. And as Dr. Dixon briefly mentioned earlier, for those of you who don't know, we had a egregious and racist Zoom bombing happen to us on the 15th now, and as sort of the news around it has sort of died down, this is just a reminder to the community and everyone that is working with us that we are dedicated to continuing our movement as a Black Studies Center in order to make this education that you don't find in the mainstream narrative accessible to everyone, especially within our community. And so as I said earlier this week, it's a great reminder of the importance of these conversations and why we need to have them here. And it's just even more motivation to continue with what we're doing with a strong fist ahead. So tonight's moderator is Dr. Fredrick Douglas Dixon, who is the Executive Director of the Black Studies Center at the University of Wyoming, and he will be moderating our talk tonight and introducing our speakers. So thank you all again for being here tonight, and be sure to use the chat box and the Q&A boxes throughout the discussion to ask questions, provide commentary, and things of that sort.
Thank you, Timberly. Timberly does great work for the University of Wyoming's Black Studies Center, and we appreciate what she does. And just to be honest, she's off now to do community engagement work, and we know that that will turn out in a very positive way. So thank you for sacrificing. So good evening, everyone. Tonight is a very special night where we have a conversation that will be relevant locally and nationally. But before we get into introducing our panelists, as Timberly mentioned, on February 15th, we had a disruption of Zoom bombing. And tomorrow night, for all of you all who are in our earshot, we will be having a town hall meeting tomorrow night, starting at 6 p.m. to discuss the realities of what happened. So I'll be the co-host along with our president, Seidel, Dr. Jackie Bridgman, who is the director of School of Culture, Gender, and Social Justice, will be along, as well as Timberly Vogel. So this particular issue has come to pass with the University of Wyoming, and we want to deal with it directly and in a formal sense where we have this conversation that will allow for people to get their feelings out about it, have a discussion about it, and hopefully move forward. So please feel free tomorrow to join us at 6 p.m. You will find those in the university communications, and you will find them again on our website at the Black Studies Center. So we thank you for it, and we hope to see you tomorrow. And then Thursday, which is our very last event of our Black History Month celebration, we will have a conversation about challenging the police narrative about defunding. And we have a host of great folks that will have a conversation about it. So that's Thursday at 5:30. So without any further ado, I want to introduce our panelists for tonight, Dr. Karla Slocum, who is a professor of anthropology and the director of the Institute of African American Research at the University of North Carolina. And I rest assured that how this conversation will move forward, she'll have great insight, and we'll find it very important. And as we move along, Brigida Blasi, and we thank you so much for joining us. And when we think about the rise of public historians, Ms. Blasi falls right into that category. So we're glad to have you here. And she's at one time she was the curator and executive director of Sweetwater County Historical Museum. Now she's at the University of Wyoming, and this is her alma mater as a public historian at the American Heritage Center. And we want to say thank you to the public, to the Heritage Center. We have worked very closely with them over the years. So that puts us in really good space. And then our last panelist, but definitely not the least, Erin Jones, Cultural Affairs Producer for WPR, which we are co-hosting. And tonight, this allows for us to add to the narrative of those who would like to partner, we would like to partner with as well. So what we will do now is we'll begin our conversation. And so when we think about the title, A Tale of Two Towns, Black Homesteaders and the Myth of the American Dream. Well, that ties right into what we wanted to talk about this month period, being we gave a critique of the death of Black Wall Street and the myth of the American dream. So this falls in at a great time towards the end of the month. So first of all, when you guys think about that title, what's the first thing that you think of, and how does that evoke any thoughts about forwarding this information to the public? So Dr. Slocum, feel free.
It's always the mute, right? When you say the title, are you talking about the title of this program or the title of your other one on the death of Black Wall Street? Both
well,
are really
feel free to talk about the death of Black Wall Street, but we would surely like to tie it to the Tale of Two Towns, Black Homesteaders and the Myth of the American Dream.
Right. Well, I was really fortunate and pleased to be a part of the program of the podcast and that story that Wyoming Public Radio put together. Really fortunate and glad that it was done, because I do know that we have so little material on and so little exposure about Black communities, historic Black communities and Black towns in the West, and especially the Mountain West. As I mentioned, as we were preparing for this, my specialty is Oklahoma. And what I know from my work on Oklahoma is that Oklahoma is one of the places that we know more about than we do know about further west, actually. So I think the title is, and the program is very important just for by sheer virtue of the fact that we have so little material and information and awareness about these historic settlements, historic Black settlements.
Thank you. So Ms. Blasi, this ties directly into Wyoming in any way you'd like it, but when we look at the title, and for someone who is, say they won't be a part of this conversation, what should they look to when they see this title, and what's important about this conversation?
Well, you know, especially in places like Wyoming, there's a lot of myth making that goes on when it comes to, I think, especially Black history and also other multicultural histories. You know, I was kind of a late addition to this panel, so my research is actually mostly with miners in the West and not so much homesteaders. But especially in public history as well, of course, we deal with a lot with myth making and storytelling, as I'm sure Erin does as well on the radio and media and with public media. But you know, there's a lot of myth making that goes into family stories, local stories, regional stories, and a lot of it has to do with this sort of dichotomous sort of viewpoint that people have about these histories in the West and in places like Wyoming. There's a lot of belief that things like racism never existed in Wyoming, and these, you know, these pioneer stories that never really actually existed, but are sort of woven into the fabric of these tales. And what it really boils down to is that these were really complex stories and lives that have mostly been lost. And if people want to find them, I would very much encourage that, because there are very few of us looking into this in Wyoming. And I think, you know, lately with what's been in the news, a lot more people are interested in it. But there's still not very many representative voices that are, and people that are looking into this. So I would encourage anyone to, you know, start research on their own, get a hold of people like me, people in museums, other repositories that can help you start the research and start to look into these tales, because there's quite a bit out there to find yet.
Thank you. And I think the way that you allowed for young scholars to become involved, and I know there are at least some portion of students from the University of Wyoming who are taking Intro to African American History now on this call. So I'm sure that they've heard that, and I'm glad that you put it that way. That this is.
Well, I have plans, Dr. Dixon, to talk to you in future about working with some of your students. I have projects in mind.
Yeah, we got students who are very intrigued about writing and challenging the dominant narrative. So it always comes to be, but just for you to put that out there the way that you did, I'm sure that they're paying a little more attention right now, because that's a call to action. And Erin Jones, thank you so much for showing up. Here's what I have to say. I want to take a step back and think about Tennessee Watson. We have to be straightforward. This is the brainchild of Tennessee Watson and WPR. So let us go no further by thanking her. And she did so much to move this from an idea into something that was very concrete. So she pulled the strings. She did a lot of the networking. And so we thank her dearly. But as we have you here, Ms. Jones, the role of WPR as a partner, and then the role of the media and how the Homesteaders and the idea of the West all come together. It's very intriguing. So if you would like to continue that conversation.
Yeah, well, this all started for me, this concept of a tale of two towns and Black homesteaders in the West, with a conversation with the host of our podcast, The Modern West, Melody Edwards. I'm the story editor of that podcast, and we are currently finishing up a series called Ghost Towning that's all about the shrinking of small towns across the American West. And as part of that, she assigned me to do an episode about these two towns in particular, Empire, Wyoming, and Deerfield, yes, Colorado. And she assigned that to me because I'd done some reporting on Empire before, and so had she. She had also done some reporting on Deerfield. And we really just wanted to dig deeper into the stories of those two towns and how they came to be, because as Brigida mentioned, there are so many people in Wyoming that just want to erase Black history in Wyoming. And so to your question of the role of the media, I think part of our job is to, like dig up the narratives that aren't the dominant narratives. And as Dr. Dixon, you and Brigida both mentioned, hoping that students and other young people and people in general are finding those narratives is so helpful, because that means that then there's someone for us to interview. And it was such an honor to interview Dr. Slocum as an example, and on her work of Black towns and their importance. And I learned a lot from Dr. Slocum in particular about how ghost town is not a good term to use for these former towns. So yeah, I think the role of the media in this is to contribute to the overall narrative, to add stories that perhaps eventually can become myth in a better way, that's more robust than maybe what our dominant myth has been.
Thank you. Go directly, please. Go ahead, Dr. Slocum. We were coming to you anyway.
Well, it sounds like you were actually going to pick up on what I was about to pick up on as well.
Please do. That's why we have you here. Thank you.
I thought I heard you start to say something about ghost towning, the term. And that's what I was going to pick up on as well. And I think I just wanted to really sincerely thank you and acknowledge that you did connect with what I was talking about. I felt that it was somewhat risky because here you'd use this term and I was challenging the term itself. And, you know, I didn't want to sound critical, but I also wanted to be true to what I know from my research. And I was really, really pleased to see how you incorporated that into the program. And I've actually told a few friends that how pleased I really was, that I felt like this was a real sort of success story for me, because I felt like you were willing to embrace and really rethink this concept. And I love the way you worked it into the program.
So Dr. Slocum, please give us more insight on how this becomes part of your research agenda, literally, and then how you look at that in the context of what needs to be added to the dominant discourse.
Yeah. So I'm also interested very much in the narratives about these communities. And I believe that there's a prominent narrative about the Blacktown past. And that narrative is one that when we hear about Black towns, that's the one that we hear the most about, their success historically, their success in the past. And there's nothing wrong with telling that story. Those are very, very important stories. And I think what we've been hearing here today is also underscoring that, you know, we don't want to erase this history and act like it really didn't happen. So it's very important to acknowledge that history. I would also be a proponent of acknowledging what the Black town and Black community present is all about as well, not just revering what Black towns were, but also what they are. It's challenging, as you find in a town like Empire that no longer exists physically, it's not incorporated anymore. There's not a population there. The infrastructure is gone. But this is where my anthropology comes in. You know, I believe in the memories, the symbols, the generations of family stories that are still ways that these communities have a life. And so they're not forgotten and they still live on in certain kinds of ways, even if they aren't tangible in that kind of way. And for me, looking at Oklahoma, some of these communities do still exist, right? There are still 13 historic Black towns that exist in Oklahoma, but we still find that emphasis on the history of them rather than on what they are in the 21st century for similar reasons. I mean, I think this concept of ghost towning, the idea of the shrinking Black towns or shrinking small towns, those Black towns that still exist in Oklahoma, the 13 that are there, they get recognized for what they were, because what they are today is they're very small. You know, some of them, the town that John Hope Franklin grew up in, the sign says population 66 when you drive there. It's talking about a population under 100 people. You're talking about a community that is economically challenged. You're talking about a community that has large out-migration. So there's a way in which you can think this community doesn't have much going on now. But again, that's where I go back to the memories and the ways that people still are invested in the stories about those communities, and that means something to their families and to generations of people. And so that's what I mean when I question or have concerns about a concept, a typical concept of ghost town that suggests that it's just gone and there's nothing there.
Well, thank you. And I'm always interested in how that becomes one of those narratives that lasts longer than the actual narrative. And then when we think about that, Mrs. Blasi, with public history being in the fray and adding so much now, how does that become what eventually writes the story about these towns?
You're asking me?
Ms. Blasi, can you hear me?
I couldn't unmute myself there for a second. Sorry about that.
Okay. But we got Dr. Slocum just in case she's ready to go.
That's good.
We're coming right back to you, Dr. Slocum. We appreciate it.
There were so many things that you said, Dr. Slocum, that pinged with me. You know, public history, I think, has a very important role. I think a lot of us, excuse me, are just now learning how important that role is in the narrative that we present to the public. For example, in my museum, before I came here to the university, where I was the curator for 4 or 5 years, and I was the director for 5 years, you know, for most of that time, we had an old exhibit up that, you know, was about internationalism, because that's a big thing in that area in Southwest Wyoming, because the coal companies actively recruited people from all over the world. So at the late 19th, early 20th century, they were the most, you know, multicultural towns in the entire region. And so that's something, you know, they really like to celebrate there. And included in these exhibits about, you know, multiculturalism and excuse me, and internationalism was pictures of Black people. And I kept saying, like, they're Americans, they're not international, they're American. This idea that, or that nobody ever saw that as an issue, because it was just automatically thought of that they were other from our dominant narrative in the rest of the exhibit. And that stayed up a long time, because even after I noticed it, because it just never was priority, until finally I put my foot down and said, this has to go, because we're the ones who are creating this narrative. You know, people see us as an authority, and so if this is the story we tell, this is the story they believe is true. And I think the up and coming generation is really embracing that. But I think we also, those of us who are in positions of, you know, management and power especially, are very much responsible for creating more opportunities, so that, you know, middle-aged white women like myself are not the only ones that are telling these stories and the only ones in charge of the narrative. So I think there's a heavy burden there and a heavy responsibility that I think more of us need to embrace. But you also you talked about some interesting things there, Dr. Slocum, about identity and memory and stories, and I think that's a big reason why some of these stories have been able to be forgotten in Wyoming. A lot of the early Black families who came here, especially in the coal mining communities that I study, and Empire is a good example too, that after a generation or two, they left. And so it's easy for people to forget that they existed, even though into the 1920s, we had really thriving Black communities in a lot of areas. But a lot of the towns like Dana, the coal mining town that I wrote about recently, it only existed for about 18 months. And the company, the Union Pacific Coal Company, literally erased them from the history, their whole story. So it's very easy to just say, well, they never existed, and therefore, you know, racism never existed, and this never existed, and it's just easy to forget it, because the people who are descendants of them, we still do have, of course, you know, some Black families in these towns, but they are not the early families. They left when coal busted in the 50s and went to places like Denver, and so that memory left with them. And so I think it's more the responsibility now of the community as a whole, and not only academics, but especially public historians, because we interact so much with the public, to make sure that these stories don't go away and keep those memories alive. And I focus a lot on genealogy and bringing back the individual story for that exact point as well.
Thank you. I want to encourage all of our participants to place your questions and your thoughts in the chat box. We want this to be interactive, and we don't want to allow what happened last week to dictate the MO in which we use to have these conversations. So please feel free. And Ms. Jones, when I think about the role of WPR, since I've been here right now 3 years, and WPR has always been a helping hand, always providing a bridge to get some of our stories out, or have these conversations that allow for history to breathe in a different way. So when we think about, and I'm very interested, and from my limited understanding of empire, I'm always very interested in how empire has this still, when the name rings, there's still a lasting effect, particularly here in Wyoming. We understand that. But WPR has played a large role in that, and I would surely like Dr. Slocum to go into it. But if you could begin on the idea of what empire means and the role that WPR has played in moving the story forward.
So empire, as I'm sure many people listening probably know, Empire was a town from about 1908, and then I think the very last folks left in the early 30s. But the bulk of the people were gone, I think, by about 1920. And it was a really small community of Black homesteaders on the Wyoming-Nebraska border. And for decades after it disappeared, people started leaving Empire, partly because, in large part because there was a lot of racism against folks in Empire from surrounding communities, surrounding homesteaders, white homesteaders. And it's culminated in a lynching, in a murder of a man named Baseman Taylor. He was murdered in the sheriff of Torrington's custody. And after that lynching, people started leaving Empire. They felt unwelcome. And for decades, that was pretty quiet in Wyoming history. Nobody really talked about it for decades and decades. I talked to one historian, Todd Gunther, who studies Empire, and he said that he got a lot of flack when he started studying it in Wyoming, that people really his colleagues, his mentors really resisted him studying Empire. He said that they wanted to know the nice history, quote unquote, and not about the lynching and not about the racism. And so for a long time, it was really quiet, but it was through the work of academics, including Todd Gunther and others, really uncovering this, that eventually this became known in academic circles. And finally, there was some work with the Wyoming State Museum in Cheyenne that they started a traveling exhibit. They began an exhibit that became a traveling exhibit about Empire. And our role has just been to report on what's happening. So, there's a museum exhibit and we report on it. And now with the Modern West, we're able to do a longer piece and tell the story of Empire. And the history of what has happened there. But we can't do that without the people doing the original research, which comes back to the work of people like all of you on the other panelists and Dr. Dixon. But yeah, so I don't know if that answers your question about what Empire is and what it was and why it's important.
Well, thank you. Absolutely. I'd like to go to Dr. Slocum and extend what empire means in time and space, and then think of how this connects with other Black towns and the similarities across the country.
Sure. First of all, the name Empire, really wonderful. Second, I think when we want to try to think about Empire's story and how it connects to broader stories across the United States, this time period that you're mentioning coincides with what we know about Black towns in the West, period. That's the formation period. That's also the period where we start seeing people leave. And why are they leaving? It's the same story, because the racism that led them in many cases to form these communities, to come to the West, seeking to leave the South in a lot of cases, the Deep South, leave the plantation, leave the Deep South's Jim Crow. It started creeping into areas of the West as well. I saw one of the questions in the chat. This relates to one of those questions. And so we started seeing people move out. There are other complicating factors as well. There are economic factors. But there certainly were the extreme racism and violence against Black people that led people to start moving to other places. Sometimes people were even leaving the country. There are Back to Africa movements that spawned in actually Oklahoma, thinking about getting out of the country altogether. So this is that part of the empire story, I think, is is connected very much to what we know about the Blacktown story more broadly in the West.
Thank you. Oh, we got a couple of really good questions. So if you guys don't mind, can we jump into the questions? All right. So Byrne asked, he wonders if the depopulation of Black towns coincided with anti-Black lynching, especially in the period from 1900 to 1920. There's a couple things that ring loud to me, 1900 to 1920. What one would consider the nadir, or the worst period of the American lynching movement. And also I think about the rise of the eugenics movement. So these two social movements at the time, it goes along greatly with what Dr. Slocum says. There are multiple veins that have these people looking for new spaces. And a lot of it is tied to violent responses. So when you guys hear that question, I want to make sure we get it correctly. If the depopulation of Black towns coincided with anti-Black lynching, especially in the period from 1900 to 1920. Anyone, feel free.
I'm sure Dr. Slocum can talk about this more broadly.
Absolutely.
But in the coal mining towns that I have studied, mostly in southwestern Wyoming, the populations that, the Black population didn't dwindle until coal busted. And it's not because there wasn't violence. There were actually 2 lynchings in 1917 and 1918 in Green River and Rock Springs. In fact, Todd Gunther also wrote an article on all the lynchings in Wyoming, which were disturbingly high per capita. And during this time, but I also I have an article coming out about another family in that area, and 2 of the sons served in World War I, and so they were part of that time period as well, where Black soldiers were coming back from service expecting to be treated with more respect, expecting to be able to wear their uniforms, and instead were met with some of the worst violence, racial violence within a short period in a long time that is often referred to as the Red Summer, because there's so much violence. And again, 2 lynchings just in the 2 towns in that area right there. Yeah, sorry, I kind of lost my train of thought. So it's a tough time period, but at the same time, this is also sort of at the peak of in that area, and in many areas, the social uplift movements where people were church building and really trying to build up these communities. And there was such a strong presence and a strong Black community there that there really weren't too many people that left. But then there are, and they did build churches, and they made a lot of progress during those years. There were a lot of Black-owned businesses, things like that. But they were the exception, I think, not the rule. As Erin already talked about, a lynching was one of the things that put a pin in empire. It was just sort of a last straw. So,
well, I think that a couple things come to mind from your response, Ms. Blasi. One thing that happens in this time period, and I'm so glad that it didn't get past us, that World War I, and you discussed how Blacks had this sort of expectation when they returned. But let's think about World War I and think about it in this vein, that there was a radicalization of Black soldiers in World War I. And when we see them having the experience of going to Europe, them having the experience of having a way to critique the racial experience in America to that of the racial experience in Europe, it began to radicalize them And I think one of the things is that when we see them return to America, one of the things that we use as what we call white massive resistance was to lynch them in their uniforms. That became popular during that time. But it's one piece that I'm sure that all of you have heard of before that represents what I say when I say there's a radicalization of Black soldiers in World War I, is the Houston Mutiny of 1917. And the Houston Mutiny of 1917 in itself stands as one of these anomalies, one of these pieces that lets you know that, you know, the way that we tell history, a lot of times we think of Black soldiers and they don't have this same fight as they did to fight for freedom for America that they do for themselves. So it's pretty interesting when we think about that period of time and how the radicalization of Black soldiers during World War I with the Harlem Hellraisers, Harlem Hellfighters, and the Buffalo Soldiers, the 24th Infantry. And this shows a pattern of resistance to what we call white massive resistance. But I wanted to make sure we got that injected into the narrative. But when we think about how this particular time period, lots of other things are going on because you said it greatly. 1920 represents if you will, the beginning of the new Negro movement. And we know by 1920, August 20th, 1920, we see the rise of Marcus Mosiah Garvey. And there is this gumbo that's cooking in America that's no longer esoteric. So how would you guys inject that into what we find happening in Wyoming? And one more thing, I do remember that we have been discussing the lynching in 1903 here in Laramie of Joe Martin. So it is indeed not isolated events, but a pattern. So please feel free. Did I lose the conversation, everybody?
I feel like I talked a lot, so someone else's turn.
Well, if we can just go back to that time period and how things were changing in America. I mentioned the radicalization of Black soldiers, and we used an event for that. So a lot of times we don't hear about those kind of events because it doesn't support the mainstream narrative, but it is indeed itself very telling.
I would agree with that. I think that we see Black people organizing, and we see Black people trying to put forth counter narratives to the narratives of one, Black inferiority, and just trying to put forward different sorts of narratives to assert rights and to gain rights in that time period. So I think we have both of those things going on. We have on the one hand, as we've been talking about, this lynching movement, and at the same time, we have people organizing against all of that that's happening. And I think the creation of Black towns and the population of Black towns is part of that effort. I mean, as we start to get more into the, towards 1920, that's not really necessarily the heyday of the formation of Black towns, but you have to think about the formation of Black towns as also a form of resistance to the kinds of violences that Black people were experiencing in the early 20th century. As we've been talking, I've also been thinking so much about Tulsa because, of course, we're not talking about, we're talking the Tulsa race massacre of 1921 is what I'm thinking about. And it's the same sort of dynamics that we're discussing here, with a community that has formed, a community that is vibrant, a community that's amassing wealth, and a massacre to destroy that community. And what we don't hear about also is kind of the rise after the massacre of the community as well. And so I think that's something also that we can pay attention to. And I would really dare to say that across American history, we have these kinds of dynamics going on repetitively, where we have the violence and we have the organizing, we have the movements and the counter movements happening all the time. Black people are always challenging the constraints and violence and threats that they experience still today.
I think we got a really good question here. What role, if any, did the resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan in the United States during the 1920s have to do with the migration of African Americans? One part of the question. Second part, did the resurgence impact Wyoming? Well, when we think about the second wave or the rise of the second wave of the Ku Klux Klan, we directly dealt with that in our programmatic efforts. So we had a film series that was called Cinematic Realism and Racist Propaganda. And one of the key events is the movie Birth of a Nation. And when we see how impactful that movie was on many regards, I mean, its cinematic value being the very first motion picture, but cinematic realism, how this story about the problematic nature of Blacks becoming part of the body politic is the major narrative. It becomes very interesting when we think about the rise, second wave, the rise of the second wave of the Ku Klux Klan. So can anybody speak to that? Anybody, please feel free.
I've been asked this question a couple times, and all I can say is that it needs more research. As far as Wyoming goes, we know that the Klan was here. There are some stories, but there's been very little research that I know of. So I can never answer that question fully. And I have never run across it in my research making a huge impact in the towns that I've researched. But I haven't researched it specifically, so I can't say for sure. And I know Leslie, who's asking that question, actually wants to do some more research herself. So that's good. I hope that more people are looking into this, and it's definitely on the list because it's you know, semi-secret. They were a semi-secret organization, so it's a little hard to find in some of these smaller communities. You'd think they'd be right out and proud about it, but not so much in Wyoming. So I'm sorry, I can't answer that. Erin, have you ever run across anything? No.
Dr. Slocum, is there anything you'd like to add to that?
I don't know specifically about the Klan in Wyoming, so I don't have expertise in that area to be able to address that. It would surprise me if the Klan didn't exist at all in Wyoming, but I take your point. I think it is important that the work is done, the research is done to try to fill that history out.
Okay, another question says, through your research about empire, I guess this speaks directly to the oral histories and the power of the oral histories. Did you discover any known descendants from that town, from empire? If so, if you did, what was the oral histories like?
So I did not. I chatted with historians who have studied empire, and the descendants they were able to discover had since passed away. So if anyone knows any empire descendants, let us all know. We'd love to hear from them. Yeah, but it was interesting to chat with the historians who had talked with the descendants and learned about, you know, what life was like, what they grew, what kind of houses they lived in, where they held church, things like that. It was fascinating to learn those sorts of things from the historians who had talked to those folks.
Okay.
Sorry, this isn't about empire, but that's actually a huge part of what I did with the town of Dana, which was the coal mining town that I said only existed for about 2 years, and from 1889 to 1891. Was, you know, as we talked about earlier, Dr. Slocum mentioned, you know, memory making and things like that, and the memory of descendants. And I talked about how that's a big reason why I believe a lot of these towns are able to just sort of, you know, disappear from our memory, our collective memories, is because the descendants are gone. And also as a way to restore identity to like anonymized groups. I think too often in history, we can just say, you know, oh, the Black miners or this or that group, as they all sort of, had groupthink and no individual identity. And as a way to restore identity and also just sort of like individual, desires and agency and whatnot to historical peoples. I did track down some descendants and ended up finding this really neat story, this narrative that went from Wyoming to Nebraska to Canada to Portland. And some of the descendants were ended up being like civil rights leaders in Portland, Oregon, and very well known up there. And I was able to do some interviews with a great-great-granddaughter. And on top of that, what was really significant was I identified from the family keeping the photos, never knowing that their family actually lived in Dana, I was able to find photographs of some of the Black miners in Dana, whereas before that, reaching out to every repository in the region, I couldn't find any photos of Black miners, period, identified or not, prior to the year 1900. And so through that genealogy and what a lot of people consider, like pseudo history, that sort of that sort of public history bent on research, I was able to, restore identity to these people who were literally wiped from the historical record by the company and by the press, actually. And so it can be really significant to a story to find, identity. People connect with the story when you have these individuals and their stories connected with it. So anyway, I just wanted to interject that, since we can't track anyone down from Empire yet.
Well, Ms. Blasi, it sounds like that particular repository that you got your hands on was a gold mine. It
was a family. Yeah, I tracked down the descendants, and they had pictures of their great-great-grandfather and his brother-in-law. So, yeah.
It always gives us hope that those things have not become just part of the past, and with the right way of looking at it and the diligence and things like snowball sampling, we will become very familiar with some of those stories. So one of these questions says that, how can we make sure that this becomes gospel curriculum in our Wyoming history books? Part one. Part two, and how can we challenge Wyoming's myth thinking? Please feel free, Dr. Slocum.
It seems to me that one way to challenge the myth is through the curriculum, right? And the public history work that we've already been talking about. I think the more you can get alternative narratives out there publicly and prominently, the more you start to shift thinking or influence thinking around these sorts of things. I don't know enough about Wyoming public education to know how you can get that into the curriculum, but I will just say, going back to Tulsa again, hearing Erin speak before about how Empire's history was something that nobody wanted to talk about, or at least the lynching was something that nobody wanted to talk about. That was just so true of Tulsa, that the massacre that had happened, it was up until the 1990s, it was something that nobody was talking about. It was just something people quietly discussed in their homes, but it was not public discussion. And now we come to almost the 100th anniversary of the event, and they just now have passed, I believe, a law, or at least a policy, that this will be part of school curriculum now. So it takes time, as you can see, it takes a lot of time for that to happen. Tulsa might be instructive. I don't know all the details on the ground of how they were able to move that forward to get it to become part of curriculum, but that, I'm sure that information is available, and it would certainly be instructive for other states.
Well, we had a young man who represents some of the descendants. Attorney Solomon Simmons was with us on the 15th. So his project that's going forward about Tulsa, Oklahoma, and support Greenwood. So he's definitely a contact person, Attorney Solomon Simmons. So I think he laid it out to us pretty clearly, just how those things were taking place in real time. So it was great to have him. And we have a comment here from Leslie. She said, I see some oral history opportunities here, perhaps in conjunction with the American Heritage Center. I gotta say to Leslie and the American Heritage Center that you all do amazing work and have worked with us before there was a Black Study Center. So I do encourage you to go there. I do encourage you to make sure that you use that as a resource. And I think that over the years, it's proven more than it's worth, particularly here to the university. So as we move forward, I wanna make sure that we get a chance to discuss this and get it out in a way where we see this conversation that's developing with those who are with us. What's very important to remember when one, particularly you all in your work, as you move forward with your work, what's very important to remember that many people may not know, or the structure or the process, as folks would say, in becoming very adept to this, what some would say esoteric history, and how you go about making it something that becomes part of something you'll leave for somebody you'll never meet. So anybody, please take a stab at that. What becomes important? What is something we should be looking for as a fundamental thought?
You mean what becomes important to help people become aware of this history, or?
Absolutely. In your work, what are those fundamental things that sometimes people don't have any idea about because it's not discussed?
Right. Well, I do think publishing on one hand, I mean, publishing and you know, I'm an academic. I do publish in academic outlets. I'm aware that academic outlets have narrow audiences. Mm-hmm. So many of us are now also trying to do our publishing in public venues as well. And I do think that's important. As academically trained people, we have our expectations that we publish in academic venues, but that doesn't prevent us from publishing elsewhere to reach a broader audience. And I think that's very, very important. I can't tell you how many times I hear from people that they just weren't aware of this. I'll tell you an interesting story. I'm here in North Carolina. I gave a talk in a class at Duke University next door. There was a student in the class who was from Oklahoma, and she said she from actually one of the major cities in Oklahoma, and she had not been aware of the Black town history in Oklahoma. There are 50 Black towns that existed in Oklahoma, and that's something that people didn't know. So I did feel that her being exposed to the publication, having to read it in a classroom, learning about it in that kind of way was important. I'm also part of a project with a team of others, geographers, historians, archaeologists, people in urban and city planning. And we're trying to create a digital map that will be for public consumption, that will actually show you across the country where historic Black settlements actually existed. And what we hope and what we believe will happen when the map is completed is that you'll see that there are very few spaces in the United States that did not have historic Black settlements in them. The United States was populated with these kinds of communities. So I'm hoping that the visual representation of that for people, just to be able to see what the United States looks like and how Black people have been everywhere in the United States for a very long time, that's, I think can also be influential in influencing the way people think about who Black people are, where Black people live, what the places that Black people are associated with is also.
Thank you. Please.
Yeah, I wanted to, in doing this story, I really learned a lot and thought a lot about myths. And, you know, if you've ever read any Joseph Campbell, then you might know that even though we think of myths as something that's not true, myths are really true because they inform who we are, and they inform, you know, the stories we tell about who we are and where we're going and who our people are. And somebody had earlier asked about how we challenge the myth of who Wyoming is and what Wyoming is. And, you know, even though myths feel like they're set in stone and they're limited and we're just going forward based on this limited information of a myth, they change based on stories. Like, stories are how myths are built. And so I think that academics need to do this research so that we know the information to tell a new story. The media, we need to be able to see those pieces of information so that we can tell stories. You know, somebody had asked about curriculum. Teachers need to be able to use the information from academics, from the media, to tell stories. And all of that together comes into new myths and new, you know, myths about who we are and where we're going and what this place is and who our people are. So I think that in terms of, you know, the mystery, I think you had said, like, what is important about what we need to know about what each of our work is. My work is to find the information that you all are doing and be able to tell stories about that. And so I really hope that, you know, probably most of the people who are participating in this conversation are students or are researchers. And I would just encourage you to continue doing that, because it's really important, because I can't do my job without you.
Thank you for that comment. Ms. Blasi, would you like to give us some closing thoughts?
Well, I don't know if I can say it as eloquently as Dr. Slocum and Erin, but I would say something similar. You know, first of all, just to remember that these people existed, that they were here. But two, I would definitely agree that what's really important is to get it out there in many different venues. I publish in academic journals, I publish in, you know, blogs, and, you know, we do exhibits, we do in classroom instruction. We try to get the stories out in as many ways as possible, because if you reach just that one student or that one reader, before you know it, then you've got something like Empire, where 15 years ago, nobody had ever heard of it. Now everybody knows about Empire. And so it's just a matter of, you know, keeping at it, and we just got to keep telling these stories, and we've got to keep having, you know, venues like this so that we can keep sharing it and getting people interested. So I thank you, Dr. Dixon, for putting this together, and Erin and Tennessee. So
yes, Tennessee. Yeah. I thank you all. It's been very enlightening for me. And as one who's come to Wyoming, you just never feel like you know enough about the history that we've discussed, because of things that have interrupted, because of things that have played a role in us not feeling that we can actually go and find this information. And again, to have this conversation with you all has been something that I'm sure lots of people have gained a lot of information from. And I thank you all for taking your time. And I think about it in very clear ways. One way to change the narrative is to change the narrator, right? So we owe that to future scholars for the idea of humanity when we're here now. So again, I can never thank you all enough for taking time from your schedule and the work that you do. WPR for hosting with us and partnering with us. And thank you all for your time. Dr. Slocum, there is something that I would like to talk to you about. I work with the Black Doctoral Network, and we're up for a spring virtual conference, and I'd like to contact you about how we can use some of the things that you're doing. Particularly, it'll be a pretty quick turnaround, so we'll be able to discuss